In May 2025, Indian and Pakistani forces clashed across the Kashmir border during a 4-day military operation that marked the most intense fighting since the 2021 ceasefire collapsed. What started as routine border tensions escalated when high ground conferred clear advantages. Pakistani forces positioned on elevated terrain gained observation superiority that Indian commanders couldn't counter from their valley positions below. The engagement resulted in several casualties on both sides, but here's what makes this alarming. These same terrain challenges have fueled tensions over Kashmir's high passes for decades, and today they risk flaring into something far worse. The geography that shapes this conflict operates at extremes that most people cannot imagine. The mountain fortress that divides two nations. Kashmir's battlefields reach altitudes where soldiers face life-threatening altitude sickness and frostbite that outpace combat injuries. The Siachen positions sit at altitudes typically used by high-altitude military aircraft, making them literally uninhabitable for most humans without extensive acclimatization and medical support. At these heights, a simple cut refuses to heal. Soldiers develop severe headaches that can last for weeks, and the slightest physical exertion causes immediate exhaustion. Yet Indian and Pakistani forces have maintained permanent military positions at these deadly elevations for over 4 decades, creating what military experts call the world's highest active war zone. Kashmir's 3 defensive mountain belts span from 3,000-foot foothills to 28,000-foot peaks, with each range offering unique tactical challenges and defensive opportunities. The Himalayan mountain system that dominates Kashmir creates natural fortress walls that stretch for hundreds of miles, with valleys carved so deep they remain in shadow for months during winter. These mountains form barriers between India and Pakistan, with each range offering different tactical advantages depending on which side controls the high ground. Over 90% of glacier casualties come from altitude illness and cold-related injuries, not enemy fire. At elevations above 15,000 feet, the human body cannot produce enough red blood cells to carry adequate oxygen, leading to high-altitude pulmonary edema where fluid accumulates in the lungs and drowns soldiers from the inside. High-altitude cerebral edema causes brain swelling that produces hallucinations, seizures, and death within hours if soldiers are not immediately evacuated to lower elevations. Indian military medical records from 2024 show that 847 soldiers required emergency medical evacuation from high-altitude positions due to altitude sickness, compared to 23 soldiers wounded in actual combat operations. Pakistani forces report similar casualty ratios, with frostbite and altitude-related illnesses accounting for 94% of all medical evacuations from mountain positions. The strategic mountain passes that connect India and Pakistan have determined military tactics for centuries, but modern warfare has made their control even more critical. The Zojila Pass, at 11,575 feet elevation, remains the primary route for Indian forces to reach their positions in the Sciachen Glacier region, but heavy snowfall closes this pass for up to 6 months each year, leaving thousands of soldiers completely cut off from resupply. During winter months, the Indian military must rely entirely on helicopter drops to maintain positions that would otherwise be abandoned, with each supply mission costing approximately $47,000 in fuel and aircraft maintenance. The Scarcity road system on the Pakistani side faces similar challenges, with avalanche zones that have killed entire supply convoys and forced both armies to build elaborate tunnel systems and avalanche barriers that cost millions of dollars annually to maintain. Pakistani forces hold elevation advantages across 60% of the disputed border areas, particularly in the Kargil sector where their positions on ridge lines allow direct observation and artillery targeting of Indian forces positioned in valleys below. This geographic advantage became devastatingly clear during the 1999 Kargil conflict, when Pakistani forces positioned on peaks like Tiger Hill could direct accurate artillery fire onto Indian supply routes and military installations thousands of feet below them. The elevation differential in some areas exceeds 8,000 feet, meaning Pakistani gunners can use gravity to extend their artillery range, while Indian forces must fire uphill against gravity, reducing their effective range by up to 40%. Current military positioning data from 2025 shows that Pakistani forces maintain high ground advantages at 127 key positions along the line of control, with Indian forces holding elevated positions at only 73 comparable locations. Natural disasters in Kashmir's mountains have become more deadly than traditional warfare, yet both armies refuse to withdraw from positions that nature itself seems determined to destroy. The 2012 Ghauri avalanche killed 140 Pakistani soldiers in a single incident, burying an entire military base under 80 feet of snow and ice. Indian forces have lost similar numbers to avalanches, with the 2016 Siachen avalanche killing 10 soldiers and the 2019 Machel avalanche claiming 7 more lives. Despite these losses, both militaries continue expanding their mountain positions, with India constructing 47 new high-altitude bunkers in 2024 and Pakistan building 38 new positions at elevations above 12,000 feet. The construction costs for these mountain fortifications are staggering, with each bunker requiring helicopter transport of materials and specialized cold weather construction techniques that can cost over $2 million per position. Helicopter resupply operations in Kashmir represent one of the most expensive ongoing military commitments in the world, with both countries spending a combined $340 million annually just to keep mountain positions supplied with food, fuel, and ammunition. Indian Air Force statistics show that maintaining the Sciachen Glacier positions alone requires 3,200 helicopter sorties per year, with each mission carrying risks from unpredictable mountain weather, altitude limitations, and potential enemy fire. Pakistani helicopter operations face similar challenges, with weather conditions limiting flight operations to narrow windows of opportunity that can close without warning. The Siachen base camp, which serves as a primary supply hub for both armies, sits at 12,000 feet elevation where helicopter performance is severely degraded, requiring specially modified aircraft and highly trained pilots who undergo extensive high-altitude flight training. Climate change has begun shifting the strategic balance in Kashmir's mountains as rising temperatures melt glaciers and expose new terrain that was previously inaccessible. Satellite imagery from 2024 shows that glacier retreat has opened up 23 new potential routes through previously impassable mountain areas, creating new strategic corridors that both armies are racing to control. The melting of permanent ice formations has also destabilized existing military positions, with several bunkers on the Siachen Glacier requiring emergency relocation as the ice beneath them shifted and cracked. Temperature increases of 2.3 degrees Celsius over the past decade have extended the fighting season in high-altitude areas, with snow-free periods now lasting up to 3 months longer than in previous decades. The psychological impact of controlling high ground extends far beyond tactical advantages, affecting everything from military morale to national prestige. Soldiers positioned on mountain peaks report feeling psychologically superior to enemies positioned below them, while forces in valleys experience what military psychologists call elevation anxiety, where the knowledge of being observed and targeted from above creates constant stress. Pakistani military doctrine explicitly emphasizes the morale advantages of holding high ground, with training manuals describing elevated positions as providing both tactical superiority and psychological dominance over enemy forces. These mountain barriers have created a geographic trap where neither country can achieve decisive victory, but neither can afford to withdraw from positions that geography makes nearly impossible to defend. The mountains that should separate India and Pakistan instead create a perfect environment for endless low-level conflict, where every peak becomes a prize worth dying for, and every valley becomes a battlefield that can never be fully secured. Yet the deadliest geographic weapon in this conflict flows not over these mountains, but through them. Rivers of war, the water weapon. For over 60 years, Pakistan's water needs have depended on rivers rising in India, a dynamic enshrined in the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty. Nearly 80% of Pakistan's water flows stem from the Indus system through Indian territory, creating a geographic vulnerability where 240 million Pakistani lives depend entirely on water controlled by their primary enemy. This dependency represents one of the most dangerous geographic arrangements in modern geopolitics, where upstream India could disrupt flows via dam controls, a threat Pakistan views as an existential risk. The Indus River begins its journey in Chinese-controlled Tibet, flows through Indian-administered Kashmir, and finally reaches Pakistan, where it becomes the lifeline for the world's fifth most populous country. This 2,000-mile river system passes through 3 nuclear-armed nations before reaching the Arabian Sea, creating a deadly chain of dependency where each upstream country holds the power to strangle those downstream. The river's path through Kashmir means that every major tributary that feeds Pakistan's agricultural heartland first passes through territory that India could potentially weaponize through dam construction or water diversion projects. The 1960 Indus Waters Treaty divided control between India and Pakistan, with India granted rights to 3 eastern rivers, while Pakistan received the 3 western rivers, including the Indus, Chenab, and Jhelum. This World Bank brokered agreement has survived 4 wars between the 2 countries, but now faces unprecedented strain as water scarcity increases and both countries expand infrastructure projects. The original treaty allocated water based on 1960s needs, but Pakistan's population has grown from 44 million to 240 million, while agricultural demands have expanded dramatically. India's massive dam construction program in Kashmir has transformed from infrastructure development into what Pakistan views as a weapon system. Indian engineers have built or are constructing 47 major dams and hydroelectric projects on rivers that flow into Pakistan, with each new dam creating the capacity to either flood Pakistani territory or withhold water during critical agricultural seasons. In 2024, India's Baglihar Dam on the Chenab and plans to expand the century-old Ranbir Canal prompted Pakistani complaints before the World Bank. The proposed Ranbir expansion would increase water diversions from 40 cubic meters per second to 150 cubic meters per second, giving India capacity to significantly reduce flows into Pakistan's agricultural heartland. Water availability data from 2025 shows that changing monsoon patterns and accelerated glacier melt are reducing total water flow in the Indus system by 12% compared to historical averages. The monsoon rains that traditionally provided 60% of the river system's annual flow now arrive later and with less predictable intensity, while Himalayan glaciers that feed the rivers during dry seasons are retreating at rates of 15 meters per year. This reduction in available water has intensified competition between India and Pakistan, with both countries now viewing every drop as a strategic resource that could determine their economic survival. Pakistani officials have documented what they claim is a deliberate pattern of water manipulation by India, where dam releases are timed to cause maximum economic damage. During the 2024 planting season, India allegedly released large volumes of water from Kashmir dams just as Pakistani farmers were preparing fields, causing floods that destroyed crops across Punjab province. 3 months later, during the critical growing period, India reportedly reduced water flows to their lowest levels in decades, forcing Pakistani farmers to abandon thousands of acres of cotton and rice crops. These accusations of water warfare have created a strategic calculation where Pakistan treats major water reductions as acts of war that could justify military retaliation. China's upstream position on Tibetan rivers has added a third player to this water conflict, giving Beijing potential leverage over both India and Pakistan. Chinese engineers have constructed 87 dams on rivers that flow into the Indus system, with the largest projects capable of storing enough water to affect downstream flows for months. China's ability to manipulate water releases from Tibet means that Beijing could potentially support Pakistan against India by increasing water flows during disputes, or conversely, could pressure both countries by reducing overall water availability. This three-way dynamic has transformed water from a bilateral issue into a complex strategic triangle, where Chinese decisions affect the survival of hundreds of millions of people. The economic implications for Pakistan, if water flows were significantly reduced, extend far beyond agriculture into complete societal collapse. Pakistan's agricultural sector accounts for 22.9% of GDP and employs 37.4% of the total labor force, with over 90% of crops dependent on Indus River irrigation. A 30% reduction in water availability would force the abandonment of approximately 12 million acres of farmland, destroying the livelihoods of 25 million agricultural workers and creating mass migration to urban areas that lack the infrastructure to support such population movements. The resulting economic collapse would likely trigger political instability, potential military coups, and desperate decision-making by leaders who might view nuclear weapons as their only remaining option. India's 2024 decision to suspend data sharing under the Indus Waters Treaty has created additional dangers by depriving Pakistan of flood warnings and hydrological information needed for water management. This suspension means Pakistani authorities no longer receive advance notice of dam releases or flood conditions, potentially putting millions of lives at risk during monsoon season. The treaty contains no provision for unilateral suspension, making India's action a violation of international law that Pakistan could use to justify military retaliation. The geographic reality of water dependency has created a situation where climate change and population growth are turning the Indus River system into a potential trigger for nuclear conflict. As water becomes scarcer and both countries' populations continue growing, the temptation to use water as a weapon will only increase. Pakistan's complete dependence on rivers controlled by India means that any significant reduction in water flows could be interpreted as an act of war requiring nuclear response, while India's growing population creates pressure to maximize water retention within Indian territory. Yet even as these water wars threaten to drown both nations in conflict, the most surreal battlefield between India and Pakistan lies not in the valleys where rivers flow, but on the frozen peaks where they begin. The Glacier War, fighting at the roof of the world. The Siachen Glacier represents the ultimate expression of this geographic madness, where Indian and Pakistani soldiers have maintained positions at altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet for over 40 years while enduring temperatures as low as minus 50 degrees Celsius. This frozen battlefield sits higher than most commercial aircraft fly, creating a war zone where breathing requires conscious effort and where the slightest exposure can cause frostbite within minutes. The glacier stretches 47 miles through the Karakoram mountain range, positioned at the intersection of Indian, Pakistani, and Chinese territorial claims. Operation Meghdoot in 1984 marked the beginning of this high-altitude military occupation, when Indian forces preemptively seized control of the glacier's key passes. Pakistani forces responded by establishing their own positions on surrounding peaks, creating a military standoff that has persisted for 4 decades. The 2012 Ghauri avalanche demonstrated the deadly nature of this environment when it killed 140 Pakistani soldiers in a single incident, burying an entire military base under 80 feet of snow and ice. Similar disasters have claimed Indian lives, including the 2016 Siachen avalanche that killed 10 soldiers and exposed the fundamental vulnerability of maintaining permanent positions in such unstable terrain. Siachen requires over 3,200 helicopter supply flights annually, costing India roughly $47,000 per mission due to the extreme altitude and weather conditions that limit aircraft performance. Each soldier deployed to the glacier costs approximately $15,000 per month to maintain, including specialized high-altitude equipment, heated shelters, and constant resupply operations. Pakistani forces face identical logistical challenges, with both armies dedicating enormous resources to maintaining positions that serve no civilian population and contain no economic value whatsoever. The strategic importance of controlling Siachen lies entirely in its commanding position over the geographic intersection between 3 nuclear powers. From the glacier's highest peaks, military observers can monitor activities across the entire region, including movements in the Shaksgam Valley that Pakistan ceded to China in 1963. The position allows surveillance of ancient trade routes like the Karakoram Pass and provides potential artillery coverage over supply lines that both Pakistan and China depend on for maintaining their military positions in disputed territories. Decades of military presence have transformed this pristine glacier into an environmental disaster zone where soldiers generate approximately 900 tons of waste annually. The Indian military has documented over 40,000 empty oxygen cylinders scattered across the ice, along with abandoned equipment and fuel drums that cannot biodegrade in the extreme cold. Constant helicopter traffic and diesel generator operations have created pollution levels that accelerate ice melt and contaminate water sources flowing into Pakistan's agricultural regions. Warfare at these altitudes creates tactical challenges where standard military equipment becomes unreliable and basic survival requires constant adaptation. Assault rifles jam when moisture freezes in the barrels, forcing soldiers to store weapons in heated shelters and warm them before use. Helicopter operations face severe limitations due to thin air that reduces rotor effectiveness by 40%, creating extreme dangers during supply missions. The thin atmosphere also causes supply drops to become potentially deadly when parachutes fail to deploy properly. Climate change has begun reshaping the battlefield as rising temperatures cause glacier retreat that exposes new terrain and eliminates established positions. Satellite imagery from 2024 shows the glacier has retreated 1.2 miles over the past decade, revealing previously hidden crevasses and creating unstable ice formations that threaten existing bunkers. The melting has exposed frozen bodies of soldiers killed in previous decades, along with military equipment preserved in ice since the 1980s. Soldiers who serve extended deployments on Siachen suffer permanent health damage that affects them throughout their lives. Medical studies show that 78% of veterans develop some form of permanent lung damage from breathing thin, cold air, while 45% suffer joint problems from constant exposure to sub-zero temperatures. The psychological impact creates depression and anxiety, disorders documented in over 60% of soldiers who serve multiple deployments, with many reporting nightmares about avalanches and equipment failures that continue years after their service ends. Both India and Pakistan acknowledge that Siachen contains no villages, agricultural land, mineral deposits, or civilian infrastructure. Yet neither country will withdraw from positions that cost enormous resources to maintain. Military planners from both sides have privately admitted that the glacier's only value lies in preventing the other side from claiming control, creating a strategic stalemate where national pride overrides rational cost-benefit analysis. The glacier has become a symbol of honor rather than a strategic asset, with withdrawal now politically impossible despite the obvious futility of maintaining permanent positions in conditions that kill more soldiers than combat. The Siachen conflict demonstrates how geographic features can trap nations in perpetual confrontation that serves no rational strategic purpose beyond preventing the psychological defeat of territorial abandonment. This frozen stalemate represents the perfect microcosm of the broader Kashmir dispute, where geographic pride creates conflicts that consume enormous resources while achieving no meaningful military or political objectives. Yet, as absurd as fighting over lifeless ice may seem, the geographic realities of Kashmir have created an even more dangerous dynamic where the same territorial disputes that drive soldiers to freeze on glaciers have also determined where both countries position their most devastating weapons. How terrain shapes atomic strategy. Pakistan's geographic disadvantage of having no strategic depth forces them to rely heavily on tactical nuclear weapons positioned near the Kashmir border as their primary deterrent against Indian conventional superiority. Pakistan's narrowest point measures only 200 kilometers from the Indian border to the Arabian Sea, meaning that any significant Indian armored advance could cut the country in half within days of war beginning. This geographic vulnerability has driven Pakistani military planners to deploy short-range nuclear weapons like the Nasr missile system specifically along the Kashmir frontier, with mobile launchers that can deliver tactical nuclear warheads against advancing Indian tank formations. The Nasr system has a range of only 60 kilometers, but carries nuclear warheads with yields between 5 and 50 kilotons, designed to destroy entire Indian armored divisions while keeping the nuclear exchange geographically limited to the immediate border areas. India's nuclear doctrine promises massive retaliation against any Pakistani nuclear use. But Kashmir's mountainous terrain severely complicates their ability to respond proportionally to tactical nuclear weapons. Indian nuclear strategy calls for overwhelming nuclear response to any atomic attack, regardless of size. But the geographic realities of fighting in Kashmir create scenarios where massive retaliation might cause more damage to Indian forces than Pakistani ones. If Pakistan uses tactical nuclear weapons against Indian troops advancing through Kashmir's mountain passes, India's promised massive retaliation could irradiate the same valleys where Indian soldiers are operating, essentially turning nuclear response into self-destruction. The confined geography of Kashmir's valleys means that radioactive fallout from Indian nuclear retaliation would affect Indian-controlled territory just as severely as Pakistani positions. Nuclear weapons deployment in Kashmir's high-altitude environment creates unique technical challenges that affect both countries' delivery systems and targeting capabilities. Ballistic missiles launched from altitudes above 10,000 feet experience different atmospheric conditions that affect their flight paths and accuracy, with thinner air reducing drag, but also decreasing the effectiveness of guidance systems that depend on atmospheric pressure readings. The extreme cold at high altitudes affects electronic components in nuclear weapons, requiring specialized heating systems and environmental controls that drain battery power and reduce the reliability of guidance systems. Mountain terrain also creates radar shadows and communication dead zones that complicate nuclear command and control, with valleys that block radio signals and peaks that interfere with satellite communications needed for precision targeting. Kashmir's narrow valleys and mountain passes could channel radioactive fallout in completely unpredictable directions, potentially spreading nuclear contamination into China and Afghanistan regardless of where weapons actually detonate. The region's unique wind patterns, created by temperature differences between high mountain peaks and deep valleys, can rapidly shift fallout clouds in multiple directions within hours of a nuclear detonation. During winter months, temperature inversions trap air masses in valleys for days at a time, meaning that radioactive particles could remain concentrated in populated areas far longer than typical nuclear fallout patterns. The Indus River Valley system could carry radioactive contamination downstream into Pakistan's agricultural heartland, irradiating water supplies and farmland that feed millions of people hundreds of miles from any nuclear explosion. Current intelligence estimates suggest that Pakistan maintains approximately 170 nuclear warheads, while India possesses around 160, with both countries continuing to expand their arsenals specifically for Kashmir contingencies. Pakistan has developed at least 6 different tactical nuclear weapon systems designed for use in Kashmir's mountainous terrain, including the HATF-9 Nasser short-range missile and nuclear artillery shells that can be fired from positions hidden in mountain caves. India has responded by developing mountain warfare nuclear capabilities, including the Prahar tactical missile system and nuclear-capable artillery that can operate at altitudes above 15,000 feet. Both countries have positioned nuclear weapons within 50 kilometers of the line of control, creating a situation where nuclear conflict could begin within minutes of any border incident escalating beyond conventional fighting. The densely populated Kashmir Valley, home to over 7 million civilians, sits directly between opposing nuclear forces like a geographic trap where atomic weapons could create unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. The valley's bowl-shaped terrain, surrounded by mountain ranges, reaching above 14,000 feet, would trap radioactive fallout like a natural containment vessel where contamination could remain concentrated for months. Kashmir's population density of 56 people per square kilometer means that even a single tactical nuclear weapon detonated in the valley could kill hundreds of thousands of civilians, while the mountain barriers would prevent evacuation and trap survivors in a radioactive environment. The agricultural areas of Kashmir that feed both Indian and Pakistani populations would become permanently contaminated, creating food shortages that extend far beyond the immediate conflict zone. Nuclear command and control systems for both countries face severe challenges in Kashmir's mountainous environment, where communication networks regularly fail and decision-makers lose contact with field commanders. The region's extreme terrain creates natural communication blackouts, where radio signals cannot penetrate mountain barriers and satellite communications are blocked by peaks and atmospheric interference. During the 2019 Balakot crisis, both Indian and Pakistani military commanders reported losing communication with their respective capitals for hours at a time due to geographic interference, creating dangerous situations where local commanders might make nuclear decisions without authorization from higher authorities. Emergency communication systems designed to maintain nuclear command authority often fail in Kashmir's environment, with backup systems frequently knocked out by avalanches, storms, and equipment failures caused by extreme altitude conditions. Geographic factors could accelerate nuclear escalation in Kashmir from tactical weapons use to full strategic exchange far more rapidly than in other potential conflict zones. The proximity of nuclear weapons to major population centers means that even tactical nuclear use would immediately threaten millions of civilians, potentially triggering automatic escalation to strategic nuclear weapons. The confined geography of Kashmir creates situations where tactical nuclear use by either side would immediately threaten the other country's nuclear facilities, command centers, and major cities, making strategic escalation almost inevitable. Communication failures caused by mountain terrain could prevent de-escalation efforts, with decision-makers in both capitals losing contact with field commanders at the precise moments when nuclear restraint becomes most critical. Kashmir's geographic isolation from both countries' major population centers creates a dangerous psychological separation where political leaders might convince themselves that nuclear weapons use could remain geographically contained. The region's remoteness from Delhi and Islamabad, combined with its disputed status, could make nuclear weapons use seem like a limited regional conflict rather than the beginning of full-scale nuclear war between two major powers. Yet this geographic isolation that makes nuclear conflict seem manageable also conceals the presence of a third nuclear power whose territorial claims and strategic interests have fundamentally altered the entire strategic equation. The China factor. Three-way geographic chess. China controls approximately 14,700 square miles of territory from the original Kashmir princely state through its occupation of the Aksai Chin Plateau, transforming what most observers view as a bilateral India-Pakistan conflict into a three-way strategic competition. This Chinese-controlled territory represents nearly one-fifth of the entire original princely state of Kashmir, making China a major power with territorial claims rather than simply an outside observer. The Aksai Chin Plateau sits at an average elevation of 17,000 feet and contains strategic mountain passes that connect Chinese-controlled Tibet with Pakistan's northern territories, giving Beijing direct geographic influence over the conflict that has dominated South Asian politics for over 7 decades. China's presence in Aksai Chin creates a three-dimensional geographic puzzle where each country's territorial ambitions directly conflict with the others in overlapping patterns that make any bilateral resolution impossible. India claims the entire Aksai Chin region as part of its Ladakh territory and considers Chinese occupation as a legal territorial seizure that must be reversed. Pakistan has never formally recognized Chinese control over Aksai Chin, but has effectively accepted it through the 1963 Sino-Pakistani agreement that ceded the Shaksgam Valley to China in exchange for Chinese support against India. This agreement gave China control over 2,050 square miles of territory that Pakistan claimed as part of Kashmir, creating a geographic situation where Pakistan surrendered Kashmir territory to gain Chinese military backing against India's competing claims. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor represents a $62 billion infrastructure project that depends entirely on Pakistani control of Kashmir territory to connect China's western provinces to the Arabian Sea through the shortest possible route. This corridor consists of highways, railways, and energy pipelines that traverse the length of Pakistan from the Chinese border to the Port of Gwadar. But the northern sections pass directly through Kashmir territory that India claims as its own. The corridor's northern terminus connects to the Karakoram Highway, which runs through Pakistan-administered Kashmir and provides China with its only overland route to the Arabian Sea that bypasses potential naval blockades in the South China Sea. Chinese engineers have spent over 8 years upgrading this route, including construction of sections that pass through disputed territory and expansion of waterport facilities that give China a permanent naval presence in the Arabian Sea. India faces the strategic nightmare of potential coordination between Chinese and Pakistani forces that could use Kashmir's geography to launch simultaneous attacks from opposite directions during any future conflict. Chinese positions in Aksai Chin provide surveillance over Indian military movements throughout the Ladakh region, while offering potential staging areas for Chinese forces to support Pakistani operations in Kashmir. The geographic arrangement means that India must divide its military resources between defending against Chinese forces attacking from the northeast and Pakistani forces attacking from the northwest, with both enemy armies potentially coordinating their operations through territory that connects their respective positions. Indian military planners have identified scenarios where Chinese and Pakistani forces could coordinate attacks that would stretch Indian defensive capabilities beyond their breaking point. Chinese road construction and infrastructure development in disputed Kashmir areas has accelerated dramatically since 2020, with satellite imagery showing new military installations, radar stations, and communication facilities that alter the strategic balance throughout the region. Chinese engineers have constructed over 340 miles of new roads in Aksai Chin during the past 4 years, including all-weather highways that enable year-round military operations at altitudes above 16,000 feet. These infrastructure improvements include permanent bridges across rivers that previously required seasonal ferry operations, underground fuel storage facilities that support extended military operations, and communication towers that provide secure communications between Chinese positions and Pakistani military installations. The road network now connects Chinese positions in Aksai Chin directly to Pakistani military bases in the northern areas through mountain passes that were previously inaccessible to heavy military equipment. China gains enormous geographic advantages from its Kashmir positions, including surveillance capabilities over Indian military movements and control of mountain passes that could become crucial during any regional conflict. Chinese observation posts in Aksai Chin can monitor Indian troop deployments throughout the Ladakh region using both visual surveillance and electronic intelligence gathering equipment positioned on peaks that overlook major Indian supply routes. The Karakoram Pass and Kundurab Pass, both controlled by China and Pakistan respectively, provide Beijing with the ability to rapidly reinforce Pakistani positions or open new fronts against Indian forces. Chinese military installations in Aksai Chin also control access to several tributary valleys that feed into Kashmir's main river systems, giving China potential leverage over water resources that both India and Pakistan depend on for agricultural and hydroelectric purposes. Both India and Pakistan keep nuclear weapons within striking distance along the Kashmir front, turning high altitudes into potential launch corridors where atomic conflict could begin within minutes of conventional fighting escalating. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists warns that tactical nuclear use in Kashmir's confined valleys could kill 50 to 125 million people, while creating global nuclear winter conditions that affect worldwide agriculture and climate patterns. Analysts warn that water and geography now shape nuclear risk in South Asia, where territorial disputes have become entangled with survival resources and atomic weapons positioned at the world's most dangerous intersection. The three-way territorial dispute creates a geographic deadlock, where none of the three countries can achieve their maximum territorial objectives without simultaneously confronting two nuclear-armed enemies. China's geographic involvement has fundamentally transformed what appeared to be a bilateral Kashmir dispute into a complex three-way strategic competition, where resolution requires agreement among three nuclear-armed powers rather than just two. Yet even as these three nations position their militaries and nuclear arsenals around Kashmir's frozen peaks and strategic passes, a quieter but potentially more decisive battle has begun to unfold in the valleys below, where the ultimate fate of Kashmir may be determined not by armies or atomic weapons, but by something far more permanent: demographic warfare, changing the human geography. India's 2019 revocation of Article 370 eliminated Kashmir's special autonomous status and removed constitutional barriers that had prevented non-Kashmiris from purchasing land or settling permanently in the region for over 70 years. This legislative change opened Kashmir to demographic engineering on a scale not seen since the 1947 partition, giving the Indian government tools to systematically alter the religious and ethnic composition of a territory where Muslims have comprised over 95% of the population in the Kashmir Valley. The revocation removed protections that had preserved Kashmiri identity and prevented outside settlement, creating legal pathways for large-scale migration that could transform the region's character within a generation. Population data from 2025 reveals accelerating demographic shifts across Kashmir as migration patterns respond to new settlement policies that favor Hindu migrants from other Indian states. The Kashmir Valley's Muslim population percentage has declined from 96.4% in 2011 to 94.1% in 2025, while Hindu population has increased from 2.5% to 4.7% during the same period. These changes appear modest, but represent significant shifts in a region where demographic composition has remained relatively stable for decades. The most dramatic changes are occurring in specific districts where government policies have concentrated new settlement programs, with some areas experiencing Hindu population increases of over 200% since 2019. The geographic distribution of demographic changes follows clear patterns that suggest strategic planning rather than natural migration flows. Hindu settlement is concentrated in areas with military significance, including towns near the line of control and regions that control access to major valleys and mountain passes. The Rajouri and Poonch districts, which border Pakistan-administered Kashmir, have experienced the largest influxes of Hindu settlers, with new communities established in villages that provide direct observation of Pakistani military positions. Urban areas like Srinagar and Jammu are experiencing rapid Hindu population growth in neighborhoods adjacent to government installations and military facilities, creating demographic buffers around strategically important locations. Pakistani officials have drawn explicit comparisons between India's Kashmir settlement policies and Israeli expansion in the West Bank, arguing that both strategies use demographic change to create irreversible facts on the ground that prevent future territorial negotiations. Pakistan's foreign ministry has documented what it calls systematic demographic colonization designed to alter Kashmir's character and undermine any future plebiscite that might favor Pakistani territorial claims. This comparison highlights how geographic control through population settlement can achieve strategic objectives that military occupation alone cannot accomplish, transforming disputed territory by changing the identity of its inhabitants rather than simply controlling them through force. Economic incentives designed to attract non-Kashmiri settlers include job reservations that guarantee employment for migrants, subsidized housing programs that provide below-market land prices, and business loan schemes that favor entrepreneurs from outside Kashmir. The Indian government has reserved 20% of all government jobs in Kashmir for non-domiciles, creating employment opportunities that attract educated migrants from other states, while reducing opportunities for local Kashmiris. Land ownership regulations have been modified to allow non-Kashmiris to purchase agricultural land, residential properties, and commercial real estate that was previously restricted to permanent residents. Tax incentives provide additional benefits for businesses that establish operations in Kashmir using outside labor, with some companies receiving 10-year tax holidays for relocating facilities to the region. Transportation infrastructure improvements have dramatically increased Kashmir's accessibility, facilitating demographic shifts by reducing the geographic isolation that previously limited migration to the region. The completion of the Chenab Bridge in 2022 created the world's highest railway bridge and established direct rail connections between Kashmir and major Indian cities for the first time in history. New highway construction has reduced travel time from Delhi to Srinagar from 12 hours to 7 hours, while improved airport facilities have increased passenger capacity by 300% since 2019. These infrastructure investments make Kashmir more attractive to potential settlers, while providing the logistical capability to support large-scale population movements. Local Kashmiri resistance to demographic changes has created new patterns of protest and insurgency that exploit the region's mountainous geography to evade security forces and disrupt settlement programs. Protests against new settlements typically occur in rural areas where mountain terrain provides natural cover and escape routes that limit government response capabilities. Insurgent activities have increasingly targeted infrastructure projects that facilitate migration, including attacks on construction sites, transportation networks, and government facilities that support settlement programs. The geographic distribution of resistance activities follows terrain features that provide tactical advantages, with most incidents occurring in areas where valleys and mountain passes create natural defensive positions. The long-term strategic implications of demographic shifts could fundamentally alter the basis for any future referendum or plebiscite in Kashmir by changing the composition of the population that would participate in such votes. If demographic trends continue at current rates, the Hindu population in Kashmir could reach 15% by 2035, potentially affecting the outcome of any democratic process that determines the region's political future. Pakistani officials argue that demographic engineering makes any future plebiscite meaningless because the population participating would not represent the original inhabitants who were promised self-determination in 1947. Demographic warfare represents a form of territorial control that could prove more effective than military occupation in determining Kashmir's ultimate political fate, creating irreversible changes that transcend traditional military victories and defeats. Yet while these population shifts unfold gradually across Kashmir's valleys and towns, both India and Pakistan have responded to the threat of demographic change by deploying military forces on a scale that has transformed the entire region into something unprecedented in modern warfare. Space. The scale of this military buildup becomes visible from orbit, where the India-Pakistan border stands as one of only two international boundaries that can be seen from space at night. Massive floodlighting systems create an illuminated line stretching across the subcontinent, revealing the extraordinary militarization between these nuclear powers. Satellite imagery captured by the International Space Station shows an unbroken chain of artificial light extending for nearly 2,900 kilometers, with brightness levels comparable to major metropolitan areas despite running through largely unpopulated desert and mountain regions. This nocturnal illumination comes from thousands of high-intensity floodlights positioned every few hundred meters along the entire border, powered by dedicated electrical grids that consume enough energy to supply electricity to cities containing millions of people. The lighting system operates 24 hours per day throughout the year, creating a permanent barrier of artificial daylight that transforms night into day across a narrow strip of territory that has become the most surveilled international boundary in human history. Over 1.2 million soldiers are currently deployed along the Kashmir border region as of 2025, representing the largest concentration of military personnel in any disputed territory worldwide and creating a militarized zone that exceeds the troop densities found during major wars of the 20th century. Indian forces maintain approximately 700,000 personnel in Kashmir-related deployments, while Pakistani forces have positioned around 500,000 soldiers along their side of the disputed boundary, with both numbers representing increases of over 40% since 2020. These deployment figures include not only frontline combat troops, but also logistics personnel, engineers, medical staff, and specialized units trained for high-altitude warfare, mountain operations, and desert combat, depending on their assigned sectors. The concentration of military personnel means that in some border areas, there is one soldier for every 3 civilians, creating a situation where military presence dominates daily life and economic activity throughout the region. The 2,900-kilometer border presents dramatically different geographic challenges that require completely different military strategies and equipment depending on the terrain, from the scorching Thar Desert in the south to the frozen peaks of the Sciachen Glacier in the north. Desert sections require specialized sand-resistant equipment, water supply systems that can operate in temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius, and vehicles capable of navigating shifting sand dunes while maintaining communication across vast empty spaces. Mountain sections demand cold weather gear, oxygen equipment for high-altitude operations, and helicopter support systems that can function in thin air and unpredictable weather conditions. River crossings along the border require amphibious capabilities, bridge-building equipment, and flood monitoring systems that can respond to seasonal water level changes that affect defensive positions and patrol routes. Both countries have invested heavily in a technological arms race that includes deployment of advanced sensors, thermal imaging cameras, motion detectors, and automated weapons systems designed to monitor every meter of disputed territory with electronic precision. Indian border security includes over 50,000 surveillance cameras equipped with night vision and thermal imaging capabilities, along with seismic sensors that can detect footsteps from distances exceeding 1 kilometer. Pakistani forces have responded with similar technological deployments, including drone surveillance systems, electronic warfare equipment designed to jam Indian communications, and counter-surveillance measures that attempt to blind or disable Indian monitoring systems. Both sides have installed automated machine gun systems in remote areas that can engage targets without human intervention, creating zones where computer algorithms make life and death decisions based on movement patterns and heat signatures. The militarized border has created an ecological disaster zone spanning hundreds of square kilometers, where wildlife migration patterns have been completely disrupted and entire ecosystems have suffered permanent damage from decades of military construction and activity. Traditional migration routes used by animals like snow leopards, brown bears, and various bird species have been blocked by fences, minefields, and military installations, causing population declines and genetic isolation that threaten species survival. The constant artificial lighting along the border has disrupted nocturnal animal behavior patterns, affecting everything from insect reproduction cycles to predator-prey relationships that depend on natural darkness. Military vehicle traffic has created erosion problems and soil contamination, while fuel spills and waste disposal from military installations have polluted water sources that support both wildlife and human communities. Border communities face severe restrictions on movement and economic activity due to the constant military presence, with residents requiring special permits to travel within their own regions and facing regular searches, interrogations, and surveillance that treat civilians as potential security threats. Agricultural activities are limited by military zones that restrict access to farmland, while traditional trades like animal herding and seasonal migration have become impossible due to border restrictions and security protocols. Local economies have shifted toward military-related services, with many residents depending on employment as guards, drivers, or suppliers for military installations rather than traditional occupations like farming, crafts, or trade that sustained these communities for generations. Advanced surveillance technology continues changing border warfare through deployment of artificial intelligence systems, satellite monitoring, and drone networks that create new tactical advantages while also introducing vulnerabilities to cyber attacks and electronic warfare. Geographic weak points along the border include mountain passes, river crossings, and desert areas, where natural terrain features create infiltration opportunities that require concentrated security resources and specialized defensive strategies. Mountain passes become particularly vulnerable during certain seasons when weather conditions limit surveillance effectiveness and create opportunities for covert movement. This militarization has become self-perpetuating, with each side's security improvements forcing corresponding responses that escalate overall military presence and technological sophistication. The resources consumed by this massive security apparatus represent one of the most expensive ongoing military commitments in modern history, draining funds that both nations desperately need for other purposes. Economic geography of conflict. These massive security investments represent just the beginning of Kashmir's economic devastation, which drains a combined $14 billion annually from India and Pakistan's treasuries through military expenditures that could transform both nations if redirected toward development projects. India spends approximately $8.2 billion each year maintaining its massive military presence in Kashmir, while Pakistan allocates around $5.8 billion for its border operations and defense preparations in the disputed region. These astronomical figures represent money that could build thousands of schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects that would benefit millions of people in both countries who currently lack access to basic services like clean water, electricity, and healthcare. The military spending on Kashmir exceeds the entire annual budgets that many developing nations allocate to education and health combined, creating a situation where the pursuit of territorial control actively prevents human development. Kashmir's geographic position between major South Asian and Central Asian markets should make it one of the most economically valuable regions in the world. But decades of conflict have transformed this natural advantage into complete economic isolation that prevents any meaningful commercial development. The region sits at the crossroads of ancient trade routes that connected the Indian subcontinent with Central Asia, China, and the Middle East for over 2,000 years, providing natural corridors for commerce that generated enormous wealth for previous civilizations. Modern Kashmir could serve as a crucial link between India's manufacturing centers and the energy-rich nations of Central Asia, while also providing access routes for Chinese goods reaching South Asian markets. Instead, the ongoing military confrontation has created an economic dead zone where businesses cannot operate. Investors refuse to commit resources, and traditional trade networks have been completely severed. Trade between South Asia and Central Asia has been essentially eliminated by the Kashmir dispute, blocking economic corridors that could generate billions of dollars in annual commerce while creating jobs for millions of people across the region. The ancient Silk Road trading networks that once passed through Kashmir carried goods worth trillions in today's currency. But modern versions of these trade routes remain impossible due to the militarized border and constant threat of conflict escalation. Pakistan's position between India and Afghanistan means that normalized relations could create direct trade links that benefit all parties. But Kashmir-related tensions make such cooperation politically impossible for leaders in both countries. Central Asian nations rich in oil and gas resources cannot efficiently reach South Asian markets because the most direct routes pass through disputed Kashmir territory where commercial traffic faces constant security threats and unpredictable border closures. Military expenditures on Kashmir force both countries to divert resources from education systems that desperately need funding to address literacy rates, teacher shortages, and inadequate school infrastructure that affects hundreds of millions of children. India's spending on Kashmir military operations equals approximately 40% of its entire federal education budget, while Pakistan's Kashmir-related expenses consume resources that could double its investment in primary and secondary education programs. The opportunity cost becomes clear when comparing military spending per soldier in Kashmir with education spending per student in both countries, where maintaining one soldier in high-altitude positions costs more than educating 200 children for an entire year. Healthcare systems in both nations face similar resource constraints, with Kashmir military expenditures representing enough money to build and operate hundreds of new hospitals that could serve rural populations currently lacking access to basic medical care. Border closures and trade disruptions triggered by Kashmir tensions create immediate economic damage that extends far beyond the disputed region itself, affecting industries, employment, and consumer prices throughout both countries. Recent border closures following military exchanges have cost Pakistani businesses hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue, while Indian exporters reported similar losses from blocked supply chains and canceled orders. These disruptions affect everything from agricultural products that spoil during transport delays to manufactured goods that miss delivery deadlines and result in contract cancellations. The unpredictable nature of border closures makes long-term business planning impossible, forcing companies to maintain expensive backup supply routes and inventory buffers that increase costs for consumers in both countries. Kashmir contains substantial untapped natural resources, including mineral deposits, hydroelectric potential, and timber reserves that remain completely undeveloped due to the security situation and disputed territorial status that prevents major investment projects. Geological surveys have identified significant deposits of copper, zinc, and rare earth minerals in Kashmir's mountain regions, but extraction remains impossible while military operations continue and territorial control remains contested. The region's rivers and mountain terrain provide ideal conditions for hydroelectric power generation that could supply clean energy to both India and Pakistan. But dam construction projects face security threats and political complications that make implementation unfeasible. Tourism potential remains similarly unrealized, with Kashmir's natural beauty and cultural heritage capable of attracting millions of visitors annually if security conditions allowed normal commercial operations. International businesses and foreign investors avoid the Kashmir region entirely due to the high-risk environment created by ongoing military confrontation and the possibility of rapid conflict escalation that could destroy investments overnight. Major multinational corporations that might otherwise establish manufacturing facilities or service centers in Kashmir refuse to consider such investments, while the security situation remains unstable and territorial control remains disputed. Foreign direct investment in both India and Pakistan suffers broader impacts from Kashmir tensions, with international investors viewing the conflict as a permanent source of instability that increases risks across all business sectors in both countries. The mountainous terrain and harsh climate conditions that make military operations in Kashmir extremely expensive also severely limit economic productivity by increasing transportation costs, restricting agricultural activities, and making infrastructure development far more difficult and costly than in other regions. Maintaining supply lines to military positions at high altitudes requires specialized equipment and constant helicopter operations that cost far more than equivalent operations in accessible terrain, while the same geographic challenges make commercial transportation prohibitively expensive for most business activities. Agricultural productivity remains limited by short growing seasons, difficult terrain, and restricted access to markets, while industrial development faces enormous infrastructure costs for power generation, transportation networks, and communication systems needed for modern economic activities. The fundamental irony of the Kashmir conflict lies in how the military competition for control over valuable territory has systematically destroyed the economic benefits that make that territory worth controlling in the first place. Yet beyond these man-made economic disasters, an even more fundamental force has begun reshaping Kashmir's strategic landscape in ways that neither military spending nor diplomatic negotiations can control. Climate change, the new battlefield. Rising temperatures across the Himalayan region have accelerated at twice the global average rate since 2015, causing massive environmental shifts that are reshaping the physical battlefield where both armies have positioned hundreds of thousands of troops. Climate change has transformed what was once a relatively stable geographic dispute into a dynamic situation where melting ice, shifting rivers, and unstable terrain create new flashpoints for conflict on an almost monthly basis. These environmental changes are not simply background conditions affecting the Kashmir dispute, but have become primary drivers of escalation that force both countries to constantly adapt their military strategies and territorial claims to match a landscape that no longer resembles the geography their conflict was originally based on. Glacial melt throughout the Kashmir region has accelerated to unprecedented rates, with 2025 satellite data showing that major glaciers have retreated an average of 23 meters annually over the past 5 years, compared to 8 meters annually during the previous decade. The Sciachen Glacier alone has lost approximately 1.2 kilometers of ice mass since 2020, exposing terrain that has been frozen for thousands of years and creating completely new geographic features that neither country had previously considered in their territorial calculations. This rapid ice loss has revealed mountain peaks, valleys, and strategic positions that were previously inaccessible, forcing military planners to reconsider defensive positions and supply routes that were established based on permanent ice formations that no longer exist. The newly exposed terrain has created disputes over land that neither country had previously claimed because it was covered by ice that both sides assumed would remain permanently frozen. Military positions throughout Kashmir that were constructed on supposedly permanent ice foundations now face constant threats from unstable ground conditions as permafrost melts and ice formations shift unpredictably. The Indian military has been forced to relocate 34 high-altitude positions since 2023 due to ice instability that threatened to collapse bunkers and observation posts built directly on glacier surfaces. Pakistani forces have faced similar challenges, with 28 positions requiring emergency evacuation or reconstruction as ice formations beneath them cracked and shifted. These relocations cost both armies millions of dollars while creating temporary vulnerabilities that enemy forces can potentially exploit during the construction of replacement positions. The constant need to rebuild and relocate military infrastructure adds enormous costs to operations that were already among the most expensive military deployments in the world. Changing weather patterns have made high-altitude military operations significantly more dangerous and expensive by creating unpredictable conditions that increase accident rates and equipment failures. Average temperatures at elevations above 15,000 feet have increased by 3.7 degrees Celsius since 2015, but this warming has been accompanied by more extreme weather variations that create sudden temperature drops, unexpected storms, and rapid weather changes that can trap soldiers in deadly conditions. The number of weather-related military casualties in Kashmir has increased by 89% since 2020, with more soldiers dying from avalanches, altitude sickness, and exposure than from combat operations. Equipment designed for stable cold conditions now fails more frequently due to temperature fluctuations that cause metal components to expand and contract beyond their design tolerances. Water scarcity driven by climate change has dramatically increased the strategic importance of Kashmir's rivers and glaciers, transforming water resources from background issues into primary sources of conflict that could trigger military escalation. The total water flow in Kashmir's river systems has decreased by 18% since 2020 due to reduced glacial melt during critical summer months, when agricultural demands peak in both countries. This scarcity has made every glacier, river, and water source a potential military target, with both armies now positioning forces specifically to control water resources rather than just territorial boundaries. The strategic value of controlling water sources has increased to the point where small streams and seasonal water sources now receive the same military attention that was previously reserved for major mountain passes and strategic valleys. Extreme weather events have begun disrupting military operations with increasing frequency, creating security vulnerabilities that both armies struggle to address while maintaining their defensive positions. The 2024 monsoon season brought unprecedented flooding that damaged military installations, destroyed supply routes, and forced temporary evacuations of border positions that had been continuously occupied for decades. Avalanche frequency has increased by 156% in Kashmir's military zones since 2020, with these natural disasters now occurring during seasons when they were previously rare or unknown. The unpredictability of these extreme weather events makes military planning extremely difficult, as commanders cannot reliably predict when positions will become inaccessible or when supply operations will become impossible due to weather conditions. The melting of permafrost and destabilization of mountain faces throughout Kashmir has created geological instability that forces both armies to constantly relocate positions and rebuild infrastructure on terrain that no longer provides reliable foundations. Rock slides and landslides triggered by permafrost melt have destroyed military roads, communication installations, and supply depots that took years to construct in remote mountain locations. The geological surveys required to identify safe locations for military construction now take months rather than weeks, as engineers must account for subsurface ice conditions that could change rapidly due to continued warming. This geological instability has made long-term military planning nearly impossible, as positions that appear secure today could become uninhabitable within months due to continued environmental changes. Climate change has opened previously inaccessible mountain areas that both countries now view as strategically important, creating entirely new territorial disputes over land that was previously considered worthless due to permanent ice cover. Satellite imagery shows that glacier retreat has exposed 127 square kilometers of new terrain in disputed border areas since 2020, with both armies racing to establish positions in these newly accessible locations. The strategic value of this newly exposed terrain often exceeds that of traditional military positions because it provides surveillance capabilities and defensive advantages that were impossible when the areas were covered by ice. Competition for control over these climate-exposed areas has become a new source of border tensions that neither country's original territorial claims addressed. These environmental changes are creating conditions where geographic advantages that have remained stable for decades can shift within months, forcing both militaries to constantly adapt their strategies to match terrain that changes faster than their planning cycles can accommodate. The combination of unstable ground, unpredictable weather, and newly accessible territory has created a situation where traditional military doctrine becomes obsolete as quickly as commanders Geographic Triggers for 2025. These rapid environmental shifts have created specific geographic vulnerabilities that military analysts identify as the most likely triggers for major escalation in 2025. The Mendhar sector's ridgelines represent the first critical flashpoint, where Pakistani forces positioned on heights reaching 8,000 feet above valley floors can direct sustained artillery fire onto Indian supply convoys and defensive positions while remaining protected from return fire due to elevation advantages. The terrain creates natural funnels that force military movements through predictable routes easily targeted from above, as demonstrated during recent exchanges where Pakistani artillery crews maintained bombardment for hours, while Indian forces struggled to locate targets positioned on reverse slopes, providing natural cover. Poonch Valley crossings constitute the second major flashpoint, where seasonal water levels determine whether infantry and armored vehicles can traverse critical terrain features. These river crossing points become strategically essential during different times of the year, with elevations dropping from 12,000 feet to 4,000 feet within 2 kilometers, creating natural bottlenecks that whoever controls can completely dominate. The geographic reality means that small tactical advantages at these crossings can determine the outcome of much larger military operations, making them prime locations for conflicts that could rapidly escalate beyond local incidents. The suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty represents the third and potentially most dangerous flashpoint, transforming water from a resource management issue into an existential threat that could justify nuclear response. India's consideration of expanded water diversions through the Rambur Canal system would reduce flows to Pakistan's agricultural regions by amounts that could trigger economic collapse, affecting millions of people. The geographic reality that all major rivers feeding Pakistan's irrigation systems originate in Indian-controlled territory means that water disputes automatically become questions of national survival rather than simple diplomatic disagreements. Pakistani officials have documented what they claim is deliberate water manipulation by India, where dam releases are timed to cause maximum economic damage during critical agricultural seasons. Recent infrastructure development has eliminated geographic barriers that once provided natural buffers between opposing forces, bringing enemy positions closer together and increasing the likelihood of accidental contact escalating into major confrontations. India's completion of the world's first glaciated highway provides year-round access to previously inaccessible military positions at altitudes exceeding 18,000 feet, while Pakistani engineers have constructed 43 new military roads since 2022, enabling rapid troop movements during previously impossible seasons. These infrastructure improvements have fundamentally altered tactical calculations by creating new roads, bridges, and communication networks that change how both armies can deploy and supply their forces. The May 2025 military exchanges demonstrated how elevation advantages in the Rajouri sector create tactical superiority that can determine the outcome of border confrontations. Pakistani positions on elevated ridgelines provided direct fire control over Indian forces positioned in valleys below, allowing sustained bombardment while remaining largely protected from return fire. Indian forces deployed precision-guided artillery and drone-delivered munitions in response, but the confined geographic space of Kashmir's valleys meant that both sides could achieve devastating effects against concentrated targets, while mountainous terrain provided natural protection for launch platforms and command centers. Satellite surveillance systems have transformed minor border incidents into major confrontations by providing real-time information that enables rapid escalation and precise targeting of enemy positions. Indian military commanders now receive detailed satellite imagery updated every 4 hours, showing Pakistani troop movements and defensive preparations across the entire line of control, while Pakistani forces have access to similar intelligence capabilities through Chinese satellite systems. This constant surveillance eliminates strategic surprise while increasing pressure to act preemptively before the enemy can complete their preparations. Seasonal weather patterns create specific windows of opportunity that both armies monitor carefully for planning offensive actions or defensive preparations. The pre-monsoon period from April through June provides favorable conditions for large-scale military operations, with clear weather enabling helicopter operations and reduced cloud cover improving surveillance capabilities. Winter months offer advantages for covert operations as snow cover provides camouflage, while harsh weather conditions limit enemy patrol activities. The monsoon season creates tactical opportunities for surprise attacks because heavy rainfall interferes with electronic surveillance systems and grounds aircraft that both sides depend on for reconnaissance. Geographic vulnerabilities that concern military planners include mountain passes controlling access to strategic valleys, river crossings affecting supply line security, and elevated positions providing observation and fire control over critical terrain. Indian forces prioritize defending the Geogapal Pass because it represents the primary supply route for military operations in the Sciachen Glacier region, with closure potentially cutting off thousands of soldiers from resupply. Pakistani military doctrine emphasizes controlling ridge lines in the Kargil sector because these positions provide direct observation of Indian supply convoys and the ability to interdict logistics operations through accurate artillery fire. Domestic political pressures in both countries have become increasingly tied to geographic symbolism and territorial control, as leaders use map-based nationalism to rally public support and justify military expenditures. Pakistani political parties compete to demonstrate the strongest commitment to recovering all of Kashmir, with electoral success often depending on promises to expand territorial control and resist Indian encroachment. Indian political leaders face similar pressures to show progress in consolidating control over disputed territories, with any perceived retreat from established positions creating immediate political vulnerabilities. The combination of these geographic flashpoints creates a situation where multiple triggers for escalation exist simultaneously, with each potential crisis point connected to others through the same mountain ranges, river systems, and strategic corridors that have defined this conflict for decades. The terrain that makes these positions valuable also makes them impossible to secure permanently, creating an endless cycle where geographic advantages shift, but never resolve the fundamental territorial disputes that drive both nations toward confrontation. These geographic realities have transformed Kashmir into something unprecedented in modern warfare, a conflict zone where terrain itself determines the rules of engagement. Kashmir's mountains, rivers, and glaciers create a conflict geography that fuels military deadlock, water vulnerability, and nuclear danger. The same peaks that provide tactical advantages also trap both armies in positions they cannot abandon, while rivers that sustain millions of lives simultaneously create weapons that could trigger atomic war. As climate and demographics reshape the terrain, the risk of full-scale escalation grows. Melting glaciers expose new territory to fight over while destabilizing existing military positions, and changing population patterns create additional sources of tension that exploit the same geographic divisions. Only a durable political solution that addresses these geographic realities can break the stalemate that has consumed both nations for over 7 decades.